for coming. I was reflecting on this, and here it is, October 21st, nearly a year since the 2014 Women's Congress. Yeah, there's Rebecca going, yes! I can't believe it's been a whole year, but that was just such an amazingly wonderful event that so many of you worked so hard on, and it really was a wonderful success. And many great ideas came out of that are now unfolding. And one of those is, I would say, a big step on our journey is the conversation we're going to have tonight. Because one of the things that's happened for me over the last year is that I've become more deeply aware of the work of the Science and Environmental Health Network, what we'll refer to it as SEN tonight. And that's the parent company organization, the nonprofit, of the Women's Congress for Future Generations. And I didn't know a lot about them. And so now that this past year has unfolded and I've had a little more time to pay attention to things like that, I'm on staff calls and I hear about the 20 years of work that this team has been doing and the impressive work, particularly in environmental health. And I think many of us kind of have a general idea of what that might mean, unless you're one of the scientists sitting in the room. But we don't think very deeply sometimes about what really do environmental health professionals do. And so we're going to learn a lot more about that tonight, and I think you'll find it quite fascinating, as I have. Madeline is our board chair, and she is the assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Health at Boston University School of Public Health. And Madeline is one of the world's foremost experts on community-based research and a longtime friend of community groups who are working to protect their community's health. Okay, Madeline.
So I'm really humbled to be introducing you to Carolyn and Ted. So the Science and Environmental Health Network was started in December 1994 when Carolyn was hired to run this network. And we're still here, and that's a testament to her vision and strength and ability to bring people together from not only a diversity of geographic places, but areas of expertise and experience that they bring to our network. She is an environmental lawyer by training. She worked for the Sierra Club for many years, working on hazardous waste and water issues and forest management. She knows a lot about food and sustainable agriculture, and she has really brought the precautionary principle to the United States, co-editing a couple of really important books that have guided my life and work, Protecting Public Health, the Precautionary Tools for Reshaping Environmental Policy, and Protecting Public Health and the Environment, Implementing the Precautionary Principle, and I know at least one of them is over there. One of the things she did early on at her time in the Science and Environmental Health Network was hire Ted Shetler to be our science director. And he is a physician scientist, got his MD at Case Western Reserve University and his MPH some years later at Harvard University, his Master's of Public Health. Practiced as a physician in New England, lives in California now. I should say Carolyn lives in Iowa. I think you know that. But Ted has really brought knowledge from medical and clinical science and toxicology together in a way that impacts every individual's way of thinking about human health. So he has co-written In Harm's Way, Toxic Threats to Child Development, Environmental Threats to Healthy Aging, his most recent book, The Ecology of Breast Cancer, and The Story of Health. So there's a lot to celebrate tonight in terms of their productivity, and you can see it there on the table. But I just want to say thank you for talking in front of us so we can be part of your conversation. You don't get together very often, so make yourselves comfortable.
I honor the friendships in the room. The Women's Congress was born out of relationships and friendships of Anne and so many of you coming together. So many. I just see people that have made such a difference. So welcome to you. And I'm going to tell a story about meeting Ted. So one of the things about nonprofits, 18 years ago is that they had more money than they do now. And another organization, and I can't even remember the name of, invited a number of us to come to Washington, D.C. And participate in a conference on reproductive toxicants. So the toxic chemicals that interfered with reproduction. And at that event was this doctor who was sitting there, and we began talking. And he had been doing some volunteer work with other organizations and was becoming known as the doctor for the environmental health movement. And it just, even at that time, with his work with Boston Physicians for Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. So there he was, and some of you know that my father is a doctor, and my dad once came home and told me that the birth defects and childhood tumors that he was working on were actually environmentally caused. Now, my dad was Surgeon-in-Chief of Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. He really had pioneered a lot of the surgeries, and he was seeing all of certain kinds of birth defects and certain kinds of childhood tumors. And so when he said he was seeing an increase in these over the course of his career, and they were environmentally linked, and I asked him one question. I said, "Dad, why don't you do something about it?" And my dad said, "I can't prove it." And so the most powerful man I knew, someone who could keep babies alive, who could create, new body parts for children who were born, who could do almost anything, and he could not prove what he believed to be true, and therefore he could not intervene. And so when I met Ted, who was doing this extraordinary work on reproductive toxicants, and at that time, I don't know if you were working on Generations at Risk.
We were, yes.
But I met Ted, and here we are today. So we want to tell that story of how that work unfolded, how we figured out what to do with problems like childhood cancers and tumors, and problems in aging, Parkinson's and others, and then breast cancer. And when you can't prove the cause, but you see an increase, you see clusters, do we know enough to act? Do we know enough so that we can prevent suffering? Because anytime I tell you that a child's been born with some kind of problem, or a 3-year-old gets a tumor, or your 40-year-old daughter has breast cancer, these are measures of suffering. These are measures of suffering. And what I think that the work that both Ted and I have been doing is essentially work to prevent suffering. So if you hear anything, what we stand for, I think together at the Science and Environmental Health Network, all of those fabulous board members and staff, is that if we can prevent suffering, then we will do so. And so, Ted, what were you working on and thinking about? You just showed up at that meeting, and
Well, actually, it's true that I, along with 2 or 3 colleagues, was working on a project that we ended up calling Generations at Risk. We thought that there had been a lot of attention to the ways the chemical exposures and contaminants in the environment could have a variety of health effects, including cancer, of course, but that there had been too little attention paid among the general public to what actually seemed to be somewhat buried in the medical literature about how environmental contaminants could influence fertility, successfully carrying a pregnancy to term, not only structural birth defects, but what about a brain that is impaired and doesn't function properly, or the reproductive function of offspring because of what might have happened during pregnancy. That story we thought needed to be told, and so we did that in a project called Generations at Risk, and that's when I met Carolyn. But I think that the theme that emerged and that continued to emerge from the projects that followed that was that these are complex problems. That is, there are a number of factors that can contribute to what we see in our communities. Fertility compromise, birth defects, learning disabilities, various kinds of cancer, cognitive decline and dementia. We watch the trends and we see which direction things are going, and if you look back historically, they often are going in the wrong direction. And then you try to figure this out and to say, what's contributing to that? And you can't put your finger on a single cause. And so Carolyn's father, John Raffensperger, thinks that environmental contaminants are contributing to the birth defects. He's right about that. We now know, years later, the evidence is getting even more solid that some of the agricultural chemicals are directly linked to increased risk of birth defects. And he was living and practicing during a time when that chemical industry really exploded. So he saw it in his own professional life. The challenge then was to tell that story in an honest, thorough way, recognizing where the uncertainties lie, and then addressing the question you asked. So when do we know enough to ask? So my latest project was the ecology of breast cancer, which I'll talk about as well. But it's very similar in many ways. A collection of risk factors. You watch the trends, and you say, what can explain that? And I think that, for me, I actually got interested in environmental causes of breast cancer back in the late 1980s, when some of the very first papers started to be published showing where scientists had attempted to measure levels of certain chemicals in the blood or tissue of women with and without breast cancer and see how they compared. And they were looking for chemicals that last for a long time. Things like DDT, for example, a pesticide which has been banned for a long time, but because it's persistent, we all carry some residue still today. Was there a relationship? And so the very first studies looked at DDT levels in the blood or breast tissue of adult women with or without breast cancer and compared the two to see if there was a relationship. And the studies were inconsistent. They didn't all show a clear pattern, but the field began to emerge. And at about that time, there were several breast cancer clusters that were identified in the country that got a lot of attention. Long Island was one of the first, Cape Cod, and Marin County, just north of San Francisco, where when you began to look at the cancer registries, you saw that there were geographic areas where breast cancer was more common than in other areas in the same state, where you had the same registry that was collecting the data. And at that point, a lot of activist groups got very interested and concerned and said, there's something going on here. We don't know what it is, but something going on here, and we need to put some resources behind it. We can't attribute all of this to bad genes, family history, early puberty, delayed childbearing, and so on, the risk factors that have identified. Those are all real. They're important, but there's something else going on here that must help to explain these patterns. So I think we saw at that time an emerging of science and new capabilities in analysis associated with activism in this growing environmental health movement.
What's interesting about that is that they were women. So there's lots of problems out there, right? There are a whole lot of environmental health problems that are starting to emerge. But the breast cancer activists got together and started to do research. And so they were, to start asking for research and started to look for the patterns. Why were women in these locations getting more breast cancer? So they did things like, well, is it because of dry cleaning chemicals? You know, are the women in these communities using dry cleaning more than other women? Are they using more lawn care chemicals? And so it's the pesticides on their lawns. What is it? And the women who were, primarily women, who were asking the questions were doing something interesting. They were asking for more than themselves. They were not just interested in my breast cancer, my, what's happening to me. They wanted to know so that they could prevent those kinds of diseases, or the breast cancer, if they could prevent it. They wanted to know what these patterns were so that we could make social policies that would actually help us reverse the trend. You know, trends are actually scientific data, aren't they? So if we're looking at scientific data to say there's no science, well, if you've got an increase in breast cancer, and some of you have heard me talk about it, when my mom got married, 1 woman in 25 got breast cancer, and what is the statistic now? 1 woman in 8?
In a lifetime, yes.
In a lifetime.
Yeah.
1 woman in 8. So the genetics between me and my mom haven't changed so much, so something else is going on. And so these various groups started to form, Breast Cancer Action, Breast Cancer Fund, many others, to begin looking at policies and around breast cancer. And the research was progressing at this time.
Yeah, it was, and there were some very interesting immigration studies that were published showing that women who migrated from a country of low breast cancer incidence to a country of higher breast cancer incidence, which was going on because at that time there were many Asian countries, for example, where breast cancer was not common at all. When Asian women moved to the United States, over 2 generations, they acquired the breast cancer risk of the country they had moved to. If they moved in childhood, they acquired that breast cancer risk more quickly. If they moved later in life, they did not acquire the higher risk of breast cancer in the country they moved to. This was a signal, actually, that what happens early in life matters. But when you start asking the question about what's different between you live in Japan and you move to the United States, or you live in the Philippines and you move to the United States, what's different? And immediately we began to see studies that went out. So somebody said it's the diet. It's the diet. And if you look back over 35 years of nutritional epidemiology looking at breast cancer and the diet, it's really quite instructive, because people's hypotheses initially were it's the fat in the diet. And then they would create a study to look at that question, or it's something else in the diet. But doing it with the data that were available to them. And what's interesting to me is I did the research for this book, The Ecology of Breast Cancer. What's interesting to me is to see how this field has changed over the last 35 years. Where now, something that I think is intuitively obvious to many people, and that is that we don't eat just single nutrients. We eat food. And food is in patterns. We have mixtures of fats and carbohydrates and vegetables of different kinds and in different proportions. And we need to be looking at dietary influences on breast cancer risk through dietary patterns and not just individual nutrients. And the other thing that has finally happened is that because of large cohort studies that have been assembled that got them together when women were earlier in their life, so they actually could begin to get some sense of what childhood diets were like, some really interesting signals have emerged just in the last few years. So, for example, the Mediterranean-type diet, which is probably familiar to many of you. It's not a strict recipe, but it features lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, very little red meat, fish, and then olive oil as a primary source of fat in the diet. It's not a low-fat diet by any means. It's got healthy fats in it. But the Mediterranean diet is associated with lower breast cancer risk. And then, if you're able to look at childhood diets, some really interesting signals have emerged. The Nurses' Health Study number 2 was purposefully put together to include a lot of younger women who they could follow for a longer period of time, gathered data about their diets during childhood and adolescence, and have now published data that is results from 15 years or so of studies showing that higher red meat consumption in adolescence, childhood and adolescence, is associated with about a 40% increased risk of premenopausal breast cancer. compared to the lowest red meat consumption. And that childhood soy consumption, and when I talk about soy, I'm talking about very lightly processed. It's tofu, miso, that kind of thing. Not the fractionated soy that our industrial model has taken all the soybeans out of our fields, then fractionated into various oils and other components. Some goes to feed the animals in the industrial feedlot, but a lot of the oils and fractions end up in our processed food. And as you walk through the supermarket down the middle aisles and look at processed food labels, there's soy in many of those things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about whole soy, lightly processed soy, is associated with a reduced risk of breast cancer. And the risk reduction is stronger and more apparent if the childhood diet features that kind of soy as opposed to the adults. There's a risk reduction in both cases, but it's even stronger when the childhood diet shows us. This is more of the signal that what matters in breast cancer, early life experiences matter. A final observation along that line is that, going back to my original comment about DDT, as the importance of early life experiences began to become more and more apparent, scientists began to ask, well, maybe we should be looking at what chemical exposures are in childhood and see what the relationship to breast cancer risk decades later. The problem was that we didn't have a good way of knowing what childhood exposures were to many chemicals. Many of them, of course, exposure might be long gone. It was just no way of knowing until Barbara Cohen and her colleagues at University of California, San Francisco gained access to a collection of blood samples that had been collected in the Kaiser healthcare system years and years before, of women who were pregnant at the time, joined a study, blood was drawn, and it was frozen. And those samples still existed in a serum bank. And Barbara Cohen and her colleagues were able to gain access to them, and were actually able to measure DDT levels, both in mothers who were pregnant at the time when they entered the study, so that they could know what the fetus had been exposed to in terms of the actual level of DDT, because the blood was drawn from mother while she was pregnant. And the study that they published this year showed that higher levels of maternal DDT during pregnancy resulted in a 4-fold increased risk of breast cancer in the women offspring of those women. So what was going on in childhood and fetal development was far more interesting and important probably than what was being measured in people in their adult life. So there's a story that emerges here from the immigration studies and from the lifespan story that I've told you that says we need to think about this as an ecology of breast cancer. There is no single thing we can point to here. When people move from Asia to the United States, it's not just their diet changes. All kinds of things change in their lives. Think about it, the way we move around, the way we relate to each other, the social circumstances that we live in, and so on. If we go to work, we might work at night, we might not have the same sleep patterns, a whole range of variables that change. And we need to think about that as an ecology of breast cancer and bring ecological principles to it and ecological data analysis, I would argue, and bring thinking from the ecological sciences to this difficult question. And I personally think, and I think others do as well, that this applies to many other the contemporary problems in our communities. Cognitive decline and dementia, it's an ecological problem. Diabetes, childhood obesity, it's an ecological problem. And it can result in throwing up your hands and feeling a lot of despair. But on the other hand, I think that there's good news here because if you think about it as a complex system that you're trying to intervene in, you can bring systems analysis to it, ecological thinking to it, and begin to identify the strategic places in this complex web to intervene. So you shift the entire operating conditions of the system and not just look for the lawn chemical or the dry cleaning chemical, which may be playing a role. But how do we look at this more complex whole? And to me, that's meant that there's something there for everyone. Because we can't all do it all. But we do have our gifts and skills. And there are places in that complex web where we actually do work and have interest. And then to figure out how working in collaboration with others who are working at a different place in that web and thinking about what those relationships are and shifting those system conditions. I think there's actually reason to think that we can do take this theoretical complexity and say, what do I do on the ground in my community next week to try to address this problem? So that's where I end up with this.
So you've got women in places like San Francisco who are going, we can't prove causation. So much of the history of disease was single cause, single effect, wasn't it? You know, so we all know about the ships in England and not enough vitamin C and they get scurvy. So the single cause, single effect for a number of diseases was how we could grapple with this. But you heard, if you are exposed to a toxic chemical in utero, you know, that's harder to prove. So you get breast cancer at 50. How do you say, well, my mom was exposed to DDT when she was pregnant with me? What do you do about that? And so the people who were working on breast cancer said, we have to find a policy tool that doesn't require us to prove cause and effect. So when Peter hired me to work for the Science and Environmental Health Network, he really brought the network was formed in part to look at how science was used in environmental policy. And at the time, and pretty much for today, the way most decisions are made is you wait for proof. And so even with climate change, don't you hear there's no proof? It's not human caused. And you hear all of that. Where's the proof? Looking for single cause, single effect. And the way environmental decisions were made at the time was to wait for that proof and then to go ahead and enter the regulatory system. And they would do essentially something called a risk assessment. Well, you know, if you're not really exposed to it, even if it's toxic, it's not that big a deal, so we're going to allow that pesticide on the market. We're going to allow the White Earth Reservation to be sprayed with lots of toxic chemicals so that your McDonald's potatoes can be raised so that they're big enough to hang out over the French fry box. And that's actually what's happening. But you can't prove that the birth defects around in that community or the heart problems are actually associated with it. It's pretty tough to prove, isn't it? So these folks who are working on breast cancer going, well, it doesn't look like the lawn chemicals are a sufficient argument for the epidemic of breast cancer that we're seeing. So what are we going to do about it? And at the same meeting that I met Ted, I met a young graduate student who was working on a dissertation proposal and had asked me to help work on that dissertation, do a collaborative dissertation on something called the precautionary principle. Now, all of you who attended the Women's Congress have heard about the precautionary principle. And what made me almost jump out of my seat when I got a copy of this proposal in the mail was a question Peter Montague had asked me, which was, what other ways do we have for making environmental decisions than risk assessment? Because if we do the assessment of risk and we're just going to measure and manage it, so we're going to measure it, we're going to wait for the dead bodies to end up in the street. Trends are not good enough scientific data. You got to wait for the actual proof of causation. You got to have that nailed down. Then we're not going to make good decisions. We're going to see the trend lines continuing to go in the wrong direction. And so this idea of the precautionary principle, that even if we didn't have actual proof, every single element lined up of causation. So in epidemiology, when Madeline is an epidemiologist, and there are ways that there are criteria that you have to nail 7 criteria, according to a man named Bradford Hill, for whether you've actually a proven causation. Does the cause happen before the effect? Well, things like that. But if you've got 6 out of the 7, do you know enough that, say, tobacco causes lung cancer? So many of you watched the debates about lung cancer in the early 1990s and late 1980s. And the tobacco industry would put their hands on their heart and say they promised to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth in front of the congressional hearings. And they would say there's no proof that tobacco causes lung cancer. Now, why could they say that there's no proof? Because they had not actually understood and found the mechanism by which tobacco caused lung cancer. They had 6 of Bradford Hill's criteria, but they didn't have the 7th. And so they could still argue that. When do we know enough to act? And so the precautionary principle was quite a revolutionary idea. And we held a big conference on it. Ted and Peter and many others were there. And we asked the question, how would we put this into place as a different kind of tool so that someone like my father, who was looking at these childhood tumors and defects and wanted to prevent them, how could he actually intervene and make a decision? And so the breast cancer activists found this idea, the precautionary principle, and they went to officials in California, in San Francisco, and said, we need to put this into place so that we can prevent breast cancer, even though we don't know every single element of causation for it. And San Francisco adopted the precautionary principle based on our work, and led by the Breast Cancer Fund and Breast Cancer Action, and got it adopted as the overarching ordinance for all of San Francisco's environmental law. Now, acting in the face of scientific uncertainty, so the precautionary principle has these 3 elements, right? It's got the likelihood of harm, something bad's happening. We have scientific uncertainty, and then we have the mandate to take action to prevent harm. Now, that doesn't tell you a lot, right? So you heard some stuff about system conditions and an ecological approach. But what do we do? How do we actually put that into play? And so San Francisco figured out one way to do that, which was one main way, which was to do an alternatives assessment. So if you have a whole bunch of activities that could cause harm, using pesticides in the parks, herbicides in the parks, or arsenic in playground equipment, or whatever else, what are the safest alternatives? And they ended up putting into place an assessment of alternatives, and got rid of all sorts of toxic practices and habits. And it saved them money. So they wanted to do a zero-waste policy, for instance. And they had policemen and others who had flashlights at night, the guys who are probably having disrupted melatonin and are probably more likely to get certain kinds of problems because they're not sleeping with the dark. And they were throwing away disposable flashlights every single night. And they got rechargeable batteries. They saved the garbage. They saved money. And they had story after story like that of finding alternatives to harmful activities. Now, that is really an amazing kind of approach, isn't it? And so the story, that fable that I just told you, women who are noticing a pattern, the science doesn't give us the answer, even though we go, well, couldn't it be this? Couldn't it be that? And it wasn't. So it's not the lawn chemicals only. It might be lawn chemicals contributing. It might be. But to be able to have women come together and choose a new set of policies based on that kind of activism, that kind of partnership is really a remarkable story. And so in large part, it's that story that led us to the Women's Congress, because we thought, first of all, women are seeing the patterns. You know, part of the question and answer, we'll talk about the patterns you see, your grandchildren, with your children. We'll talk about the patterns you see with wildlife. You know, those are the observations that we are making and able to see. You have experience with children with what? Autism? How many of you have experience with children with autism or Asperger's? Whoa! How many of you have experience with somebody with Parkinson's disease? Whoa! How many of you have experience with someone with cancer? Okay, anybody without an experience with somebody in your family without cancer?
Oh, not in family, but friends. And,
That's an impressive thing, that when we start to make those observations together and begin to ask the questions, what can we do? What can we do? It seems to me that we've got some ideas and why we come together for things like the Women's Congress. You know, one of the things we don't talk about is what is health. And with all the focus on disease, one of the things Ted and I wanted to do is just have a conversation with you about what is health. In part because we recognize disease. And if we have, and we know how the medical system deals with disease. This is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And so the discussion is about curing those breast cancer, the race for the cure and all of that. What if we began to think as a policy matter about preventing these diseases? Where would we start? And I think that the idea that we can think about health and think about the conditions that are conducive to health. Ted quotes René Dubos, who said that every civilization creates the conditions for its diseases. If we have created the conditions for breast cancer, then we can create the conditions for health. Now, one of the other things I wanted to add to that is that not only do we create the conditions for the diseases, but we create the conditions for the injustices. So the patterns of injustice that we see and the patterns of disease often go hand in hand. So discrimination against women. One of the things I've learned is that the most important determinant of health are social stressors, racism and poverty, and they magnify the others. Ted has quite a number of case studies where he can talk about lead and iron in a child picking up too much lead, not enough iron in her diet, and then in a home that is impoverished, and the poverty magnifies too much lead and not enough iron. Story after story. And that begins to tell us about the ecological nature of this. So when we talk about the conditions of health, how do you think about that?
Well, I find health an increasingly elusive and slippery concept because, as Madeline mentioned, I come from a medical background, and so I thought I had that nailed a long time ago. And then the World Health Organization reminded us that we should think about health as not the absence of disease, but as a state of optimal, I guess is the word they use, optimal physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. So it's rather than being the absence of something, it's the presence of something. But nonetheless, you could still apply that definition to an individual person, and we think in those terms often. But the more I got into studying public and ecological health and environmental health, I realized that it was a very narrow framework, because even the healthiest individual, by anybody's definition that we might all agree is healthy, if you think about what that person's health is dependent on, it quickly leaves the boundary of that individual. I mean, just, I guess it was Ann said, so what is environmental health science about? Well, at its most basic, I suppose it's about clean air and clean water and adequate access to food and social support and the conditions that lead to those things, and that things that tend to degrade those conditions in our communities and in the ecological systems, and I should add now, of course, on the planet that we're living on, are not going to be contributing to health. And there are going to be some who are going to suffer more than others, the injustice component. So who are going to be the first ones to find their lives totally disrupted with what's going on now in terms of climate change? And we can look around the world. There are refugees all over. They're climate refugees. There are people who are starving. There are people who don't have access to adequate water. In California, we're in a fourth year of drought, as I'm sure you've heard. The groundwater is drying up now in the Central Valley, which is where a lot of the agriculture is located. And the migrant farm workers, the farm working families, many of them don't have access to clean water now. They go to the 7-Eleven and buy bottled water if it's available. They do not shower or bathe. Except once a week when they can go somewhere where there's a faucet that's running. These are some of the injustices that are happening as the environmental stressors come down on our communities. And so I think that our concept of health needs to really expand. You know, Wendell Berry, a writer, farmer, and social critic that many of us know well and have been reading his work for years, wrote an essay once, and I think the title actually was "What is Health?" And he concluded that the word has no meaning at a level that's more granular than community. That it just has no meaning at the individual level. Aldo Leopold, a famous ecologist, forester that many of us are familiar with things like the Sand County Almanac, but he was a prolific writer of many, many essays which have now been published but which are not well known. Thought about this and said from an ecological perspective that health is the capacity for self-renewal. And he was thinking about that as an ecological concept that applied not only to the whole ecosystem, but to the communities and populations and the relationships that existed within it. So it was about relationships and the system having a capacity for self-renewal. Had nothing to do with the individual. And I think that that there's value in those various perspectives. Certainly if you visit your healthcare professional in an office visit or have a healthcare professional see you in a hospital visit, you're quite interested in your individual health, for sure. But we all know now, and I'm gratified to see in medical training, more and more attention now being paid to the relationship between community health and individual health. Brown University just announced a new graduate program that is combining medical school with population health. It's a formal curriculum now, recognizing that these cannot be separated. We can't be doing public health in these buildings and medical school over here and pretending that they aren't related. And I think we see at Harvard a whole program on environmental health sciences is now being offered to the medical students and other on the campus to try to show how these these relationships and how we think about how we should actually work with them to improve a community and population health. At the same time, we're thinking about individuals. The other thing that Wendell Berry said reminded us that the word health, actually, that health, whole, and holy, all derive from the same root word. And so if we think about health as wholeness, it would follow from the actual derivation of the word initially. So those are a few thoughts.
Wendell Berry also talked about, I wrote an essay called Health is Membership. And I think a lot of what Ted was just expressing is that health is membership. It's membership in the ecological, natural world. It's access to clean air and clean water and to pollinators and to the sight of a beautiful tree. And it's membership in the social, the human world, and inequality and unequal access to the things that the social sphere offers is part of dis-ease. It's why the social stressors are such an important component of health or disease. So it seems to me that defining health in these relational terms is pretty helpful. We're going to think differently about breast cancer or other diseases, those childhood issues, if we think about what relationships are broken, what relationships need mending, our relationship with clean water or with our ability to breathe air that has not been tainted with pesticides or what have you. So it seems to me that, and I will say the joke that I've always heard about health, you know what a healthy person is? Someone who hasn't had a complete medical workup yet. So we could go with any of these definitions, but yeah.
I wonder if we're getting to be a good time to...
Is this a good time to open it up? And yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts and engage in conversation with you.